While we're all sitting here wondering what on earth to do with ourselves, while we're either self-isolating or we've been in touch with this hideous COVID-19, and while we have that terrible compunction every time the television goes on to just sit and watch and make sure that we understand what's going on and what the latest figures are, I thought it was time to do something a little bit different, to try and introduce you to some other thoughts. And what better thought to start with than that extraordinary, colourful, dynamic history of Matabeleland into Rhodesia into Zimbabwe. It's something that I have had to spend the last 10 years on, so I've got to know quite a lot about it. And it was sparked because 10 years ago I met Dr. Dumiso Dabengwa in Botswana. Dumiso and I had been best friends since we were little tackers. But I hadn't seen him for years, and there was a lot of water under that bridge. But we spent 48 hours together, and I have to truly say it were among the most fascinating 48 hours ever. But that's the subject of another podcast. I thought what I'd try and do and see whether you come along with me or not, and that is to just bring you some of the research and the adventure that I've had in doing that research in the discovery of all that history of ours. I'm hoping to get to a point where I can do them live and have a little chat screen on the right-hand side, which you can then chat to me and ask me questions and see whether I can respond. And also, if you have the same software, which I'm still working on a bit, that you can say, I'd like to come and have a live debate with you. That's great. We just split the screen and then we can go on with that. So that's a sort of basic idea of where we're at. The whole intention really just to share some of the things I found out and been absolutely fascinated and intrigued about since my meeting with Dabengwa in 2010. I suppose the first thing that really occurred to me was, well, what were the impacts that all of a sudden put our little country into the spotlight? Because it happened over a very quick period of time, relatively. And of course it was amazing things happening in the rest of the world. Now, Europe had been used for a long, long time to various empires coming in, sweeping in, started with the Romans, of course, and they came in and they blotted all these blue-faced Brits and taught them how to make roads and bridges and aqueducts and gave them an extraordinarily good system of governance. But since then, there have been all sorts of other kingdoms too, and empires, like the Turks, etc., Byzantine, etc. Each of those sweeping across and leaving their influences throughout Europe and, to a large extent, to the north of Africa. So they were kind of used to lots of colonization over that period of 2,000 years. Southern Africa had been far less touched than that. Of course, the Portuguese and the Spanish had gone out in the 15th century in their sailing ships, and I mean, really, Henry the Navigator and Bartholomew Dias were extraordinary because they still thought they were going to fall off the edge. But they didn't. They kept going. They found that they didn't fall off the edge, and they got right back home again. But it was very unpredictable. And the actual formation of a colony was beyond them. So it was all trading, and it was largely trading down the east coast of Africa, where you get a big, which had been going on for generations with the Arabs. The Arabs supplying India with spices and China, of course. And so all that trading, largely for ivory, gold and slaves, was happening in the east of Africa. West of Africa also had a slave trade. South Africa, quite early on, but not as early as the Portuguese, in came the Dutch, merely a trading post on their way to the Dutch East Indies. And it was only really when the Dutch and the French had a bit of a fight in Europe that Britain looked in and said, whoa, hang on, we cannot have nasty Frenchmen sharing the territory we're occupying at the moment with the Dutch. So then Britain stepped in South Africa. But it was all to and fro and what was going on, why, and what those influences were. So let's look at those influences. The first of them, of course, from the mid-18th into the early 19th century was the Industrial Revolution, and this changed everything. It developed an amazing new skill set. So people all of a sudden were able to mine much more efficiently. They had the knowledge how to do that. They had steam engines which could semi-automate all the things that had been done by hand. They had steam engines which could be put in ships and created a predictability that simply hadn't been there with wind-blown ships. But by 1840, the Industrial Revolution had effectively chewed up all the copper, the tin, the lead, all of those things that Britain and Europe needed to maintain that engine which started with the Industrial Revolution. So they were beginning to look out even more. Britain had started doing it earlier and colonizing earlier, but everybody suddenly focused in by about the 1840s. Now, concurrently was the abolition of slavery going on. It went over for ages. It took ages to get this to actually come about. Britain and her colonies were amongst the first to abolish slavery, and America didn't do so until 1865, which is probably not surprising. They have probably the lion's share of slaves. So the abolition of slavery then created a bit of a void in all of this, and people who'd been used to having African slaves suddenly couldn't have them anymore. And then in came a third impact. A third impact this time was Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, I hasten to say Darwin himself never actually said it, but the prevailing wisdom came to be chimpanzees, and we saw all the graphics, who slowly stood up and then became man. And the corollary to that was that as they developed through the dark skins, the less involved, through to the white and the lighter coloured skins, who were the most civilized, of course. And as I say again, Darwin never supported that theory, but it was very useful for those who wanted to still insist that the Africans were no more than hewers of wood or drawers of water. And in South Africa, that was very much the case. And to this day, the theory of evolution is blamed for an awful lot of that victim mentality that has become, unfortunately, all too prominent in Africa. So there were 3 impacts. And the final one, well, this was a strange thing called the Berlin Conference. Now, by this time, most of Africa had been quietly positioned off. And I say most, the north, of course, quite a lot with Europe interaction, and down east and west, Portuguese, French, Dutch, they all had a little slice. The Belgians were there as well. But Germany, by this stage, by the 1860s, was beginning to flex her muscles. And she thought, we don't have enough of this continent called Africa, so we better do something about it. And we will frame it in the best possible humanitarian way. Berlin Conference would allocate portions of Africa to certain countries who wished to do so and to take it on, and they had to treaty with the chiefs. Sounded good. And in exchange for the natural resources of that country, they had to provide infrastructure in the shape of roads, rail, bridges, and buildings, and a form of good governance. All sounded fine on paper. In reality, it wasn't quite so fine, because they literally parcelled out the remaining bits of Africa to various countries. Chief among them was Belgium and the Congo at that time. There was one little portion that was never parcelled out, and that was what became Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and Iceland. Today's Zambia, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. So by the time that eventually became available, every country in the world was hammering at the doors of poor King Lobengula. He's a man I feel desperately sorry for, because he just copped the lot. What had led up to his being there was that Chaka, of course, was this extraordinary military king of the Zulus. And he ran these amazing campaigns, military campaigns, on which a lot of future British military manoeuvres were based. Fascinating man. He must have been quite a brain. And his Induna, his chief Induna, was King Mzilikazi. Mzilikazi actually came originally from northern Mozambique, today's northern Mozambique, and he eventually went down, and he and his friends did a huge displays of athleticism to try and persuade Chaka to allow them to become part of that, rather than keep killing them, which he had been doing until that point. So Mzilikazi was Chaka's chief Induna. And of course, inevitably, the time came when he said, "Oh, I'm getting a bit sick of chucking all these cattle back to Chaka. Time I took my lot and set off and built my own nation," which he did. Chaka was not happy, but he managed to get away. So he drove through the northern Transvaal in what is known today as the Mfecane, where he built the Matabele people from a couple of thousand to 20,000 by the time he crossed the Limpopo, and he formed the Matabele nation. He actually was heading for the Zambezi because he knew the Limpopo was not a defensible frontier. So that's where I started my story, was the lead up to the crossing of the Limpopo by King Mzilikazi. We then talk through Lobengula, we talk through settlement, roads, of course, and all the reprobates of those days, the gold diggers and the hunters, and all the fascination of novels that were set about the country at that time. It was an amazing history. And then, as it went on, the settlement of Rhodesia, how that worked, how it didn't work, and I've argued it through my three close friends, Dabengwa, Ernest Boulay, and Pruden. So I've used facts from their lives and built the fiction around it to link it all together. And it's become absolutely fascinating. So I hope you'll just enjoy as we take that and just discover how those fictional bits became a whole part of the story, because it really is worth telling. Anyway, hope that's taken your mind off it for the last 10 minutes or so, and I will endeavour to be back again Friday next week and let everybody know when it'll be podcast, and hopefully I'll be live then and you can chat to me and we can see what we can sort out between us, just getting to know our history. So please let your friends know, and we'll try and work out how we're going to make it all work. Quite a challenge for this old duck, but we'll do our best. It's been lovely chatting to you. I hope you've enjoyed it. Bye-bye.